Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining. Welcome to Toptal's first Fireside chat. We're going to give it a couple of minutes for more people to join. In the meantime, we have some housekeeping rules. Give me 1 second. Okay. So we have some housekeeping rules. There is a chat where you can ask questions. There is a Q&A as well. I would encourage you to use the chat rather than the Q&A because this is going to be a session where we talk a lot. And if you want to ask a question and give more detail on it, or you want to explain your situation and you think that writing is not the best way, just raise your hand. You can do it in the sidebar, clicking your name, and I can give you permission to talk. So let's just give it a couple of minutes and we will start. And hi, Edward.
Hi, Eva. Nice to see you.
Okay. Okay, I think the attendee list is pretty much stable. One thing here is that we are recording. So you will have access to this recording, and this is a session where we can, we invited top tellers, but we also invited external people. So whenever I share the recording with you, you can share it in your network, that's fine. Okay, so welcome. I have to introduce myself. My name is Eva. I am the Community Program Manager at Toptal. And here we had Edward. Edward, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here this morning. So I am a 20-year veteran of the video game and VR AR industries. I live in Los Angeles, and I've been with Toptal for probably since about the summer. So, and I've worked on some VR AR projects with them. I am a UX design specialist, but I've also worked as a programmer and on a lot of different titles such as Battlefield and Star Wars and Sonic and Lord of the Rings, Medal of Honor, lots of stuff. So, but yeah, I'm really excited to be here to talk about games and UX and VR and AR. So thank you so much for allowing me to participate.
Awesome, awesome. So one thing that I saw while I was reading your bio is that you've worked with some great clients, especially one thing that popped up to me at least, because I kind of grew up, playing Nintendo and so on, and you've worked with Sega, right? So was that one of your first clients? What was it like when you were working there?
Yeah, I mean, I worked kind of indirectly with Sega. I was an employee of a company called Big Red Button Entertainment, and we had worked on a Wii U game it was a Nintendo, for the Nintendo Wii U console. And so I was working for Big Red Button, and they had a deal with Sega to make a new game in the Sonic franchise. So I was the weird kid growing up who didn't have a Nintendo. I had a Sega 8-bit system because I was just in love with Sega arcade games and such. So, I mean, eventually I got a Super Nintendo, but I mean, I was just a total childhood fanatic of Sega. So for me, like, the opportunity to work on that project was a almost like a childhood dream come true. And it also had some very interesting UX problems as well. The Wii U was kind of this sort of strange hybrid touchscreen with controller buttons on the side. So we were definitely trying to think of the needs of kids who had small hands and maybe couldn't reach the top buttons on the top of the controller and preferred to use the touchscreen where we were trying to design that project. So it was definitely a very interesting project to be and exciting to be involved with.
It's really great that you mentioned the Wii U, because it's not. I know you are an AR VR engineer and designer, and I would say the Wii U was kind of a like a pioneer in the gameplay.
Mhm.
It was not especially like UR VR, but AR VR. But um, how did you get into the field? What was it like for you to start experimenting into this space, and what got you there?
Oh wow. I mean, I I wanted to make games probably since I was in high school, and I went to school. I went to Hofstra University in New York, and there wasn't any sort of game design programs or anything like that back then. So I ended up getting a computer science degree. I figured if I could program, then I wouldn't have I could do the hardest thing, right? That was the most hardest type of job you could do in games. But I went into it with the intention of becoming a designer. So I started off with level design. Actually, one of my first companies that I worked for was Irrational Games. They were up in Boston. They were very famous for the BioShock series. And I eventually moved out to California in 2002, and that's when I first started working with Electronic Arts. And I started there as working again as a level designer, creating spatial 3D environments for Medal of Honor. But that's when I really started to get into, they didn't call it UX design in games. They called it was just, UI design. So I started doing UI design, even though I wasn't really doing the UI art or the visual design. It was kind of doing the wireframes and such. And really, like the first project I did that on was one of the Medal of Honor games, and then I had a chance to do that on a Lord of the Rings strategy game. So ever since then, it's just kind of been in my blood that just this interest in UX, user interfaces, human computer interaction, and just making things natural and intuitive, right? So about in 2014 or so, I had, after the Sonic project ended with Sega, I made a conscious decision to freelance. And around that time, lots of people in my network here in Los Angeles were already kind of migrating to VR. This was kind of when VR really started to have its rebirth, and the kind of the modern VR landscape as we know it today started to really take shape. So for me, that's kind of when I just kind of, because I made this decision I was going to freelance, that I just automatically, not automatically, of course, but just it seemed to be that a lot of people in my network were starting VR projects and they needed help with VR and figuring out the UX. So I had kind of missed the boat on the whole like mobile, when mobile became big in like, 2000, I think it was like what, 2007 or 2008, when that really started to blow up with the iPhone and mobile gaming. So I didn't want to miss the boat for VR. So that's kind of why I really ended up just getting a lot of experience in VR and just really learned about spatial UX design, more natural methods of input. So for me, it was just exciting to kind of be on the cutting edge of figuring out all these things that are new and different. So that's kind of how I got into it.
That's nice. We have Hardeep in the chat.
Hmm.
He's saying that he's a UX designer and a strategist, and he wants to find out about how user-centered design is applied in the gaming industry. I think this is a great question,
Hmm.
especially like a lot of people here, I'm sure, are UX designers, and
Hmm.
it's something to do one thing in 2D in the computer, in websites and so on. But once you have a 3D space and an interactive space, I would say that's a game changer, right? I'd like to hear your opinion here.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Hardeep. So that sounds a little bit like a two-part question. The first part of the question is how user-centered design is applied in the gaming industry, and then how do you approach UX design or user-centered design in more of a 3D spatial VR type of environment. So with regards to user-centered design in the gaming industry, the the answer is it really depends. It depends on kind of the resources that you have at your disposal. Are you working with maybe a small independent team? Are you working with a very large AAA console production with potentially 100 or more people working on it? Or are you working on a mobile game that might be maybe a more medium-sized team? So I would say that with my prior experience, I just was working at Electronic Arts for the past couple of years, and they had user research department that different teams throughout the company could get time with, and they would help you know streamline a lot of the user research, right? Whereas other teams, they do kind of more in-house, more like guerrilla style research. But I would say that the games industry is, I would say, still has a lot of it still needs to mature, I think, a lot in terms of user-centered design, because I think when you're working in e-commerce or mobile or web, it's very highly user-centric, right? And I think that at least with like tradition, like with AAA HD gaming, there's still this kind of element of like creativity or authorship. Like people go into games, they want to, as a form of expression, right? They want to create the games that they see in their heads, or they're artists and they want to create environments or characters and worlds and things like that. So sometimes like there's more, it's kind of harder to strike that balance between what the creators want to create and what the users are reacting to, or what the users feel is important. So I think it's gotten a lot better since I started in the industry. It used to be you would just do focus tests at the end of the project, and now I think they're maturing a lot more in terms of having research sessions that are either happening at the grassroots level or in a more centralized fashion. I think it's very different if you're talking about mobile games. I think because mobile games, especially free-to-play mobile games, are very highly they're much more similar to traditional web and mobile development, non-gaming development, where it's very user-centric. It's all about analytics and KPIs, and even minor changes in your how many users are using your app every day can have big ramifications, right, for what your revenue streams are like. So I think with mobile is a little bit more mature. Mobile gaming is more mature as far as like user centricity, but I think console and PC AAA HD has come a long way in the past few years. So for the second part of the question, in terms of like how do you approach UX design for like more of a 3D type of environment, I think that in probably like the past 10 years, games, the term diegetic has become a much more common parlance in the gaming industry. And what I mean by diegetic is a word that comes from a Greek word called diegesis, which means from the world, right? And so this is when you have user interface elements that are kind of embedded or part of the environment that you're exploring in a game. And this applies equally if you're making like a standard HD game that you play on your HD TV versus a virtual reality game or simulation or experience that has a whole bunch of other different constraints and things that you need to be concerned about, because VR is its own medium. It's different from designing for VR is different from designing for rectangular medium, is what I like to call them, whether it's TVs or smartphones or desktops, right? It's more spherical or circular. So some of the rules that you apply, some of the things that you apply in kind of traditional UX or UI design have to be changed or may not apply as much when you're designing for a 3D environment, and that also kind of applies to a certain extent with augmented reality, which blends elements from the real world as well as kind of this sort of artificial overlay. So that's kind of like a very broad answer to that sort of two-part question.
Perfect. I This makes me think the thing that you mentioned about mobile games, how they're a bit more traditional in the KPIs and all of that, whereas with consoles, there's more creativity. Um, what Can you talk to us a little bit about friction? I know you were saying you were, as we were talking before, you were talking about good friction and bad friction in games.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is very relevant to our talk here.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, so with regards to friction, games are different from a lot of other forms of digital experience design, in that games, they need a little bit of friction to be fun, right? Because you have this notion of challenge and flow and a different sort of engagement, where the user needs to feel like there is an obstacle for them to overcome in order to feel this sense of triumph or progression or satisfaction, right? If a game doesn't have enough of it, then the user says it's boring, depending on the nature of the game, of course. But some users really seek that. They seek that resistance, like trying to kind of like solve something and not being able to do it. And then this sort of tension builds up and then they break through. And then it's like, oh, yeah, I did it. That feels great, right? So that's what I kind of refer to as good friction, is when you have that challenge or resistance that makes it fun, right? If there's too much challenge, then you kind of risk falling into like disengagement, right? Then it becomes frustrating and you're just not having fun anymore. So it's a very, very tricky dance and a balance to strike when you're creating a game, to make sure that you have the right amount of friction. Whereas like my impression is that when you are in doing like desktop or mobile application, more utilitarian types of experience design, the notion of friction, like you really kind of want to eliminate a lot of it, right? Because it's really just about like making the goals, the time that it takes for a user to achieve a goal has to be kind of as quick and as efficient as possible. There's a number of tasks along the way. So really a lot of, I think, UX design outside of games is really focused on understanding those friction points and potentially seeking ways to minimize them. So I think, there's the notion of good friction doesn't exist to the same extent in non-gaming experience design than it does in games, if that makes any sense. I think that it's a little different if you have gamified elements in your app, for example. Then you want a little bit more of that good friction, right? That progression, so it feels like you're unlocking things and making progress. So, but I just kind of think that that's kind of a fascinating thing about UX in games, right? That's one of the things that makes gaming UX different from more traditional forms of digital experience design.
That's impressive. Yeah, I've always thought about, yes, UX design reducing friction, but then you want to have some friction, but not too much. I cannot tell you how many times I've quit playing a game because there was too much friction for me, or maybe I just suck at playing that game. But you know, it's different for each person. I see Hardeep also asking some more questions. Let's go one by one. What game would you have loved to work on? This is an interesting question. And all the attendees, please feel free to chime in to ask more questions. So let's start with this one.
Oh man,
Yeah.
that's a really, really hard question. I guess, geez, I mean, I've applied to a lot of different companies and teams over the years. So I've never had I don't know if I would necessarily say it's a game, but I would maybe say a company that I always wanted to work more with, I think, was Sony, because I think that Sony has a really great they've always had a really good first party lineup. Like a lot of their internal studios have always released games that are at a very high level of quality. So, these are games like, from Naughty Dog, such as Uncharted or Last of Us, or Sony Santa Monica Studios. They did the God of War series. They also have a studio in Amsterdam called Gorilla that worked on a series called Killzone, and then they worked on a series called Horizon. So they've always uh, put in a lot of their internal efforts are always really high polished, high quality. So but I mean, I've just never had really an opportunity to work with them directly. So, that's kind of in the past, I think that probably would have been a company that I would have liked to work for at some point. Probably also, any of the big three, really, like Nintendo, the big three, Nintendo, Microsoft. I think any of them, Nintendo especially, I think that would almost be like, they're like the Disney of games, right? They always do like really, really good stuff. So that'd be like an interesting learning experience as well. So, and I think Microsoft as well is doing some really great and exciting things recently in the gaming space with kind of really pioneering things with Game Pass, which is turning out to be like the Netflix of games. So I think they're doing some really exciting things as well in their own way, kind of regardless of what platform you're on, whether you're on PC or playing on an Xbox. So so that's kind of I don't think it's really a specific game. I think it's more just having an opportunity to work for the big three console manufacturers, I think would be exciting. So to proceed to some of the other questions here, I'll just read them out loud. So we also have, what has been your most challenging project and why? So that would probably be Lost Planet 3. That was a game that I worked on with Capcom. And I think that project was it was really challenging because I think that everybody on the project was really trying to really bring the best that they could to that project. This was kind of a sci-fi futuristic type of game, set on an icy planet. And I was kind of doing double duty on that project, both as sort of the lead multiplayer level designer, where I was supervising a team that was making like three-dimensional environments, as well as doing the lead UX on that project as well. So I think that project was challenging because we had a lot of people that were very experienced and they were all really trying very hard to make the best possible quality game, but sometimes those goals didn't necessarily align. With any type of game project, there's always there's always too many ideas and there's never enough time and money to do all the ideas correctly. So scope is something that you always have to kind of fight in a game project, and a lot of times that you have to kind of cut things out, and sometimes that can work well, but other times that may reduce kind of the overall quality of the experience. So every game has to kind of deal with that balancing act for sure.
And we have one other question. To what extent do you get to collaborate with non-designers on a gaming project?
Oh, extremely. Like game development is really all about cross-functional, disciplinary, working with non-designers, for example, engineers, working with environment artists or kind of more traditional artists. These would be visual designers, right? If you're talking about UI, but it could also be people who are making three-dimensional assets, right? Also, I think that there's been a lot more collaboration, I think, with UX research as well, UX researchers in recent years, and that's been kind of, I think, a learning process for a lot of people in the games industry who are kind of used to the big three disciplines, being design, development or engineering, and art, right? So, but yeah, I think a lot of gaming projects, I tend to think that that it's better to be kind of cross-functional and having kind of agile style, semi-autonomous teams that are feature-centric and can own a feature, versus having very large, like a design department or an engineering department and an art department. I mean, I think there's always going to be a balance between those two types of hierarchies, but for me, I think that on a gaming project, I mean, I could never do like environment art anymore, where I couldn't make a character animate or talk, that or look realistic. That's just, the level of skill and time it takes to do that is incredible, actually. So I have a really great deal of respect for people who can uh, do that. Same deal with like audio or music, right? Like I could never do that. So you really need cross, uh, collaboration with non-designers to really make games feel like a very effective holistic experience.
I think we have a lot of people here who have never worked in the gaming industry and would like to know how to get in there. Do
Hmm.
you have some advice for people who maybe we have? I see we have a mix of both. We have some UX designer, UI designers, but we also have some developers here. So, any advice for both buckets?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say that for UX and UI designers looking to get into games, I've done a lot of screening of UX designers and hiring and looking at a lot of resumes. And when I'm looking at a resume, I need to see something that shows an interest in games, right? Whether it is, a small independent project that you worked on, or perhaps like a sort of a deconstruction of a game, like a blog post or something that is indicative of how you would approach game design. Or it could even be wireframes for a sample game that you would like to make. It could be a feature like a character creator, or what we call a heads up display, or a HUD, where you have all sorts of bars and numbers and icons on the screen when you're playing and such like that. Like if I saw a resume that was just nothing but non-gaming mobile apps or websites, uh, I mean, the experience, I'm sure that the experience is relevant when you kind of get into it. But especially when you're hiring at a big company or even a small company, right? Like it can be very, to me, like hiring is the number one important function of any organization, right? So you absolutely have to make sure that you're hiring the right people. So resumes that don't have any sort of gaming, either prior experience or some project that I can look at that shows an interest in games or an ability to deconstruct how games work and how games are different, that is always going to be more of a risk than a resume or a portfolio that does show some gaming experience or at least some interest in how UX and UI function in the gaming world. So I would say for UX and UI designers looking to get into games who maybe don't have that experience, um, you know, maybe volunteer for participate in a game jam, or maybe see if there's people in your network who are working on an independent project and you could do work on a project for free for a short period of time, write a blog, deconstruct how a game that you're playing that you like would work or how you would change it. There's all sorts of ways that you could show an interest in game UX without kind of a serious or significant time commitment. So I would just instruct people just to be creative, to try to build that experience or show that interest, because that would definitely make somebody, if I'm looking to hire a UX designer for games, that would definitely help them stand out. So for the second part of the question, for engineers, it's kind of similar. If you're looking to get into games, you would need to show some experience of trying to make a game or participating in a game jam or something of that nature. Just kind of in the realm of engineering or programming, right? Games, they tend to use the game technologies that they use are very different from web and kind of mobile. I mean, you in web and mobile, you're using HTML and CSS or various different JavaScript front end frameworks. Your stack. What's your stack, right? Like, what's the back end framework that you're using, and things like that. Whereas in games, they tend to use engines. These are things like the Unity engine or the Unreal engine. Some companies, they use even proprietary engine technologies that they build completely by themselves. So the great thing is that engines like Unity and Unreal have, you can download them for free. There's tons of resources and communities out there for learning how to use these tools. And so it's very easy, it's very accessible to teach yourself how to program or use gaming engines these days. So it's really become quite democratized. So you could work on a little project yourself. You could participate in a game jam, things like that. I think all of those things are for engineers looking to get into the gaming industry. I think those are things that would also apply if they're looking to again demonstrate some relevant experience on a resume or a portfolio of some sort. There is also, just there is an exception to every rule, and there may be situations where games are increasingly online as well, and so they have all sorts of back end features as well. So there is room for specialists who you might need a database programmer or even just a traditional web developer that comes in and works for a gaming company's website, or just creating internal dashboards and things like that. So there are definitely specialist roles within games where perhaps those requirements might be a little bit looser. But if you are actually looking to work on the actual game itself and not kind of sort of these sort of secondary services or departments, you definitely need to have demonstrate some experience in a game engine such as Unity or Unreal.
Awesome. We have three more questions coming in. So Matt is asking about how you were saying the functional teams. Are UX teams centralized, cross-functional, or separated by area in your experience?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Matt. Thank you. So I think that with how game teams operate, again, the answer is it depends. It depends on how big the team is, right? So sometimes I come onto teams that are very small, and I'm kind of the only UX designer on the team. Uh, and other times there are multiple UX or UI designers on the team. And like I mentioned, there might be a UX research department externally that you're interacting with on a periodic basis to test some upcoming things. So, I think that, I think if you're on a project where there are enough people that are working on the front end, that you can kind of have a more centralized UI group that is kind of like talking about different other cross-functional teams that they might be working with. You might have one team that is working on the monetization or the in-app purchasing part of the game, right? And you might have another team that is working on character creation, and there's another team that's working on gameplay or HUD, right? So sometimes you have to kind of strike this balance between making sure that my preference is that there should be UI people in each of these kind of cross-functional departments, but at a certain point, you do kind of need to be able to see, at a you need to be able to kind of keep everybody in the UI team in a loop. So it's kind of a balance between those two things. I think that they should be embedded in the feature teams, but if the team is large enough, you may even have like a UX director internal to like a company that might be seeing several UX leads that are all working on different projects, and those UX leads might be supervising several UX designers or visual designers, or I think with the larger companies, they tend to they might have also researchers embedded in the team. So so I would say the answer to that is really a little bit of both. I think that again, it just depends on the size of the team and how many features or departments that there are that need UX or UI support.
And I have a follow-up question for that. For big companies, do you think there is any other way? Like, is there a preferred way for you to have teams distributed in big companies? And can this be avoided of having these big clusters of people in different teams?
Yeah, I mean, are you talking about game developers in general, or are you talking about UX people within games?
Just games in general, like for big companies in the gaming industry, what have you seen work in really large companies?
Yeah, I think that this has been a very interesting and challenging time for the games industry. I think that COVID has really forced the games industry to kind of adapt to and accelerate to a remote working model. I had been working remotely as a freelancer since 2014. So when I went back to EA a couple years ago, to me, like, working remotely is a lot more natural at this point. But I think for a lot of my teammates and comrades, like, it was more of an adjustment period. But I think that the games industry has really adapted very quickly to this model. And I think, like much of the tech industry and the tech sector, I think everybody is kind of realize, hey, remote working, distributed working can work. And there, things may not necessarily go back to be the way they were before, where things were very centralized. Now, there's always exceptions to that. There are game teams that I know of that they do operate remotely, completely distributed, and they are able to work together successfully. I think that it's really just about communication. Even when you have everybody working in one building together, communication is still paramount and it's still important. And I think that becomes doubly so when you are working with a remotely distributed team. So I think that, and there's also, there's kind of a risk of culture erosion, is kind of the way that I like to say it. It's really hard for people to potentially feel socially connected and feel like that they belong to a team if everything is just virtual and through Zoom chats and such. But I mean, I think that these are interesting times. I mean, they're terrible times, but they are interesting as well in terms of what it means for the future of remote collaboration in the games industry, for sure. So I don't know how well that answers your question or
Yeah,
not.
no, it's really nice, and it ties nicely into the next question that Jess Wood is asking. What tools do we need to learn to be able to prototype and communicate with engineers? I think, like, are sketches enough? What types of tools do you communicate? And I guess you have a very interesting idea here, because you're both, you're a designer and you're a developer, so you can kind of answer in what do developers want to see from UX designers, and also what UX designers can provide to developers.
Sure. Hi, Jess. Thanks for coming to the talk. It's good to see you, at least virtually. Jess and I know each other from here in the Los Angeles UX community, so thanks for coming. So yeah, I think that what that's a really interesting question. I think that what engineers look from UX designers is kind of a holistic analytic approach to anticipating edge cases, or being able to kind of like illustrate all the potential paths from the beginning to the end of a experience, whether that's a goal or a feature or a screen. Just thinking through all the permutations or variations of how something should work, because the engineer needs to look at the system holistically. They need to understand all the requirements before they go in and start programming it as much as possible. Because if they have to come in and they have to bolt or band-aid things on later without anticipating it, that makes the job a little bit harder. So I think that's kind of what engineers look for in UX designs. In terms of the tools that people use, I think that sketches are always great for me. Like, sketches are really great for the beginning of a new feature or a new project, right? Because sometimes it's just I have very loose ideas in my head, and sometimes there's something about just the act of taking a pencil and putting it down in a paper and just very loosely and free-forming, just letting ideas flow, that sometimes that for me it kind of like gets the initial momentum going on thinking about what a feature could be, versus kind of like my tool of choice is Adobe XD these days. I've been using it almost exclusively for the past 2.5 years. So almost 3 actually. I think that sketching does have a place, but I do think that once you start to get into lots of permutations or explorations or variations of an idea, then it becomes probably more unwieldy, right? Like a sketch is harder to kind of like update or tweak or change. You have to just do another sketch, do lots of erasing, which kind of feels messy. So at some point, I think XD is a really great tool for prototyping. It's made a lot of advances in the past 2 years, especially in the area of games. Like it now supports direct gamepad input. So it makes it really easy if you have an Xbox or a PlayStation controller just to plug it in and to be able to navigate just like you would if you were playing a real game. So I think that that's really good. But also, what I've also seen some engineers also do appreciate is having like a spec. We use Confluence a lot from Atlassian. They also make Jira. We use Confluence a lot. You could use Google Docs, any type of online kind of document creation tool. Sometimes engineers really want to see that. Some engineers they may not necessarily want to see a prototype. They may want to see like still mocks with bullet point, kind of highlights or call outs on the mock, numbered things that correspond to things in a column, and maybe describe things out. The value of that is that, if you have a prototype and if it gets very ornate, you have to click through a lot of screens and you could potentially get lost in various branches or logic. But if everything is kind of like exported or listed out, then it becomes more of a reference. But the problem with documentation is that it almost immediately becomes stale as soon as you create it, right? Because people are just always, especially in games, like games people are so intensely creative and they always have ideas and they're always playing games. Different new games are always coming out. So, and people have discussions and they change their mind all the time on things that they want to do. So keeping documents up to date can be really challenging. So for me, that's kind of why I really lean into prototyping and just you can, because it's live, it feels like a game. It does have constraints, but it most closely approximates what it would feel like to actually have the game. But I do think that sort of the flip side on the UX side, like I think UX designers that can understand development and can speak and interact effectively with engineers, I think will always have an advantage over those who don't, because I think that good design happens when you embrace constraints, and that your ability to speak with an engineer and on a technical level understand the constraints and why a system works a certain way or why something else may not be possible because of time or resources. I think that there are secret wins lurking there. So I think it always, it pays to seek out those win-win situations and understand your technical constraints. And I think your engineers will appreciate you more for really kind of thinking and anticipating and embracing those constraints. And I think it will result in better designs as well. Necessity is the mother of invention, right?
Nice. Matt Davis is asking. He's a huge Star Wars fan, so he wants to know what game you worked on for Star Wars.
Oh, okay. So BF2, thanks, Matt. That's a great question. So BF2 is Star Wars Battlefront 2, and Fallen Order is Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order. So I worked on Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order. So I did not work on Battlefront 2, although I know people who worked on Battlefront 2. It's funny, there are actually two Battlefront 2s, believe it or not. There's the original Battlefront came out during the PlayStation 2 the time of the original Xbox, right? So this would have been around 2004 or so. So there was a Battlefront 1 and there was a Battlefront 2. And I actually worked for that company too. It was called Pandemic Studios. They were here in Los Angeles. And then years and years later, EA bought Pandemic, and then they have the rights to the Battlefront name, but then they got the Star Wars license years later, so they decided to reboot Battlefront 1 and Battlefront 2 again. So I didn't work on either of those Battlefronts, but there are just a lot of Battlefronts out there. But I did work on Jedi Fallen Order, and in particular, I worked on a lot of the sort of option screens and controller configuration settings, and as well as the some of the accessibility settings, right? That's another area that I think is also growing a lot in games, is that game companies are thinking more about making sure that games are more inclusive for all sorts of different types of people. And that includes people with various forms of impairments, whether it's visual or mechanical or hearing, audio related things. And I think that's an area where games is really growing and becoming more mature. And so for me, it was exciting to be able to help that effort with Jedi Fallen Order. We basically made it so that when you start the game, usually when you start a game, there's a bunch of calibration settings, things like adjust the brightness until this funny image can no longer be seen on your screen. Um, and what happens sometimes is with people, for example, who have different forms of color blindness or audio impairments, right? They have to dig through a lot of menus to be able to find the settings to tweak it so that it's optimal for them. So what we wanted to do on Jedi Fallen Order is to make sure that those settings were front loaded. So that was the very first thing that you saw. So that ensures that, the experience is intuitive for a broader portion of our audience, and by extension more inclusive. So I think that that's kind of what I was able to focus on, and for me, that I think is an area that's really exciting for games moving forward. I think good accessibility is not just good for people with impairments; it's good for everybody, and so it just improves the quality of the UX as a whole. So that kind of describes some more of my experiences with working on Star Wars Battlefront. But kind of like working with Sega on Sonic, working on a Star Wars game was also really fun because it's again, it's like childhood dreams coming true. So that was really exciting too.
We have another question from Hardeep. How are VR games typically prototyped or explored?
So that's a great question, Hardeep. Thank you. I actually do a lot of prototyping uh, in VR with kind of traditional 2D tools. I do a lot of stuff in Adobe XD, but the way I kind of approach it is, I kind of mentioned earlier about sort of like you don't necessarily want to think in rectangles as much. You want to think in terms of circles and spherical, right? Virtual reality is a artificial reality, and so when you think about our physical reality is a spherical user experience, right? It surrounds us in 360 degrees on all axes infinitely, right? So I think that when you're thinking about um, VR design and to a certain extent AR design, it helps to think about how you have user experiences in your physical reality, right? So my kind of gold standard for VR user experience is this game called Job Simulator, where you're it's the conceit of the game is that you live in this future that it's this very kind of uh, cartoony looking game, right? Where you live in this future where robots have taken over everything. And for fun, people do these simulations where you pretend to be a burger flipper at a fast food company, or you pretend to be a car mechanic, right? And so they really kind of gamify and and streamline or abstract what it's like to be working in a fast food restaurant or as a car mechanic or in an office. And the novelty is just you're grabbing gadgets and things and knobs and levers, and it's giving you instructions on things to do. And to me, that is just like that's how you should be interacting with VR. You should be interacting like you do in the real world with your hands and your fingers. Ultimately, it's going to be your voice, your gestures, even your where your eyes are looking on the screen. We have there's a technology that's called there's a specific name for it, but it's basically like sensors in the VR headsets can track where your eyes are looking, and so it can change there's all sorts of rendering and user experience or interaction ramifications of those types of technologies. Um, so I think that it helps to think about how you would interact with something in the real world, and so that brings in the whole field of like industrial product design, ergonomics, even architecture, right? All of those fields become a lot more relevant when you're prototyping and thinking about how do I, create or define virtual experiences. So I think that you can do prototyping. There are some tools that you can use to prototype in VR and AR. Kind of one of the simpler ones is there's a tool called Sketchfab that allows you to really kind of quickly create 3D geometry. And then you could upload it to SketchUp, which is a website. And then SketchUp has an option to view in VR. So if you have a VR headset that's attached to your computer, you could look at the 3D geometry that you created in Sketchfab and look at it and kind of experience it in a spatial way. There's other frameworks. There's one that's called A-Frame, which is kind of like the syntax of it is kind of like HTML. So if any people have any experience tinkering with HTML, that might be a way of kind of like, kind of defining objects or even simple interactions in VR. And at the high end, you can always kind of dip your toe into Unity or Unreal, because like I said, there's a lot of tutorials out there. And I think that will always be, that type of experience will always be a benefit of somebody who's looking to get into VR and AR. But sometimes for expediency, it's sometimes even just doing like cardboard prototyping, like making dioramas or taking pieces of cardboard and pasting or taping things together in 3D space and putting them around your room to kind of indicate how like an augmented reality experience might work. Even that type of stuff is effective. That form of it's not necessarily paper prototyping. It's kind of more like cardboard prototyping. But so yeah, there's a lot of interesting ways and fun ways that you could prototype experiences for UX for VR and AR.
Thank you, Edward. Okay, we can squeeze in one last question. Jess is asking, are there any good tools you'd recommend for VR research?
Yeah, I would say that with UX research, a lot of the sort of practices, because UX research is very much based on psychology. Uh, I think that a lot of those practices do translate over, right? So if you're, for example, if you're doing usability testing, making sure that you're thinking about asking your questions in a way that minimizes bias, being aware of bias, and making sure that you're not mitigating that with how you're collecting your data is important. So it's a little bit more challenging sometimes because somebody might be in the experience and how they're thinking and feeling might be, when they have a headset on, might be difficult to ascertain. But a lot of the VR headsets have sort of like a secondary screen mode, so you can see on a monitor or TV on the side, you can see what that person is seeing, so you don't have to ask them like what's going on. You have a little bit more of a sense of what they're going through. But I do think that things like Unity analytics, I think, are really great because if you're experienced with Unity, what you can do is you can kind of, as the user is going through an experience in VR, you can collect data on them, right? You can collect data on what they're looking at, what they are, where they are going, what they're interacting with, and you can start to, and you can even develop heat maps on that so that you can kind of see where users are looking or where they're what spaces that they're physically spending, not physically, but virtually spending time in the virtual environment. So Unity, as far as last time I checked, I think Unity Analytics is not necessarily available for free. It's, I think, part of like one of Unity's higher service tiers. But I certainly think that it's really worth it because, as we know, what users do and what they say are oftentimes very different. So you need to be holistic in terms of like the data that you're gathering and such, and you need to look at both of those things, right? So I think a tool like Unity Analytics is really helpful, but again, Unity may have a steep learning curve for non-engineers, non-developers, and to kind of like get to that level where you're using Unity analytics, it's definitely possible, but there might be a number of steps of just getting used to Unity in the first place before you start customizing, what types of data that you're collecting and how. But certainly, I'm a big proponent of UX research. I think that's to me that's why games fail and other games succeed. Is that one of the contributing reasons is the ones that I think invest in UX and invest in research are going to increase their likelihood of success. So I think that that also applies in VR as well. So a lot of those techniques, they will cross a lot of the interviewing and research techniques, they will cross over, but it just requires a little bit sometimes adaptation in terms of the methods because it is a different medium.
Okay, we are on time, perfectly on time. So thank you, Edward. Thank you so much for
You're welcome.
being here, for sharing your knowledge. Everybody, we will make the recording available. I'll post it in the AR/VR channel in case you want to check it out. Edward is available on Slack, Toptal. So if you have any questions for him, I'm inviting people to get in touch with you, Edward, if that's okay.
Absolutely, yeah. Feel free.
And if anybody wants to organize a fireside chat or a game jam or something like that, get in touch with me. I think a game jam would be a really good idea for Toptal if you're interested.
Yeah.
And thank you, everybody. See you.
Okay, thank you everybody so much. Thanks again. Cheers. Bye-bye. Stay safe.